Good afternoon and welcome to our regularly scheduled meeting of the Finance, Audit, and Budget Committee. I'm Jeff Rader. I chair the committee and I'm joined by Commissioner Lorraine Cochran-Johnson. I expect Commissioner Larry Johnson to join us shortly. And I see that staff and I think I saw another couple of commissioners here, but first item of business is the review of our minutes. Commissioner Cochran-Johnson, have you had a chance to review and do you have a motion?
Yes, I find no fault with them as written. I would move approval.
All right, I will second that. And all in favor, please raise your hand, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. The minutes stand approved. So the agenda items 1801, 1752, 53, and 54 were dealt with earlier today in the Board of Commissioners meeting. They were favorably approved, and so we will remove them from the agenda since they've already gone to the commission. Let's go now to the debt management policy. I believe that staff has worked on the substitute that we introduced this morning. And so Mr. Manson or other members of staff, if y'all would please, Mr. Allen, please present the amendments to the debt management policy that y'all have worked on.
Yes, sir. We'll get it pulled up. Mr. Allen, can you pull up and present the debt management policy?
Absolutely. One moment. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
See it?
Okay, great. So commissioners, we'll go through each of these items. John, if you would like to work in tandem or, I'll gladly take it, just let me know.
So just as a sort of context, you'll notice that this is a version that was first approved in 2018. And we have reviewed it in light of our current debt management needs. And so these revisions are intended to specifically address recommendations from staff as well as observations on current needs. So please go ahead with that. This is building off of work that had been accomplished at some effort in several years ago.
Yes, sir. So we'll first start with these proposed recommendations. Staff has worked with, of course, Commissioner Rader, worked with law on some of these revisions, and we're still working with law on future edits that may be made based off their review, but based off staff's review as well as input from commissioners, we'll go through each of these red line changes as we're seeing in these screens. So in item HH, first of all, this first recommended change regarding private or direct placement. This is some language that we've worked specifically with our finance director on. So one of three methods of sale where a new issue of securities is sold directly to institutional or private investors rather through a public offering of securities. Investors purchasing privately placed securities are often required to agree to restrictions as to resale and requested or required to provide a private placement letter to that effect. And the county may issue a private placement with or without the use of a placement agent. Such determination will be made based upon the current market conditions. This is something we've worked with CFO McNabb on.
Yes, and so this is a refinement of a definition that would be used in the policy later. Are there any questions about this? This was suggested by our finance staff.
Mm-hmm. No questions.
Okay, let's go to the next one then.
Next red line, as we get into the actual policy itself, right under section G here, there's a definition to be added under GIFA for WIFIA. The Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act of 2014 established the WIFIA program, a federal credit program administered by EPA for eligible water and wastewater infrastructure projects. WIFIA and the WIFIA implementation rule outlined eligibility and other requirements for prospective borrowers. This is just adding a definition.
Okay, any questions?
No.
Great, let's move on.
Next, this section K under the refinancing of outstanding debt. This was a recommended change based on best practices that we received from our finance director, CFO McNabb. So as a general rule, refunding, and I'm looking at this middle sentence here in the paragraph. As a general rule, refunding will be undertaken only if the present value savings of a particular refunding will exceed change from 3% to 5% of the refunded principal. And it goes on, continues within that section.
Any questions?
No.
Simply increases the delta a little bit, I guess in recognition of the cost and trouble associated with refunding. Let's go.
Next change, section M, and we'll spend a little bit of time here. So this is on the financing team selection process. First of all, and I'll read through it, the county employs outside financial specialists to assist in developing a bond issuance strategy, preparing bond documents, and marketing bonds to investors. The key participants in the county's financing transactions include its financing advisor, bond counsel, disclosure counsel, in parentheses, the change is for a public offering, the underwriter in a negotiated sale, and county representatives. Other outside firms, such as those providing paying agent / registrar, trustee, credit enhancement, auditing, or printing services are retained as required. The objectives of the selection process are participation from qualified providers, ensuring service excellence and competitive cost structure. Unless exemptions apply, the county's purchasing policy governs the selection of professional service providers. So in subsection A here, there's some language to be amended or added into it as it relates to financial advisory services. So first of all, the county shall maintain at all times a contract for financial advisory services, whose services shall be available to both the administration and the Board of Commissioners, Finance, Audit, and Budget Committee, which shall be rendered to each of the advisor's fiduciary capacity. The financial advisor shall be resident to metropolitan Atlanta or maintain offices and staff with relevant skills within the region. The authority to authorize services under the contract shall be exercised by either client, subject to available budgetary capacity. The county may solicit competitive proposals for financial advisory services based on the recommendation of the finance director. A panel appointed by the finance director or their designee shall review financial advisory proposals. Staff also added this next red line. The Board of Commissioners, Chief of Staff, or their designee shall also be included within the panel appointed by the finance director to review financial advisory proposals. And it goes on, and I'll finish out the subsection for comment. The county may engage either an independent financial advisor or may employ a financial advisor who is a member of an investment banking firm. If the financial advisor is an employee of an underwriter, that firm may not participate in negotiated sales of the county debt.
All right, commissioners, this is intended to make sure that we don't get caught on the back foot when we need to actually act on this. And Commissioner Cochran-Johnson, I see you have a comment.
Yes, I think we're already on the back foot. Is that not?
Well, we are only to about, $35, $40 million, but other than that.
Yeah, only that. Because as I'm reading it, there's some things we sit here, even with our best intent, we just don't have the capacity to do. And at this point, we lack what we have here. So I totally get it, but I just wanted to point out, if this were already in place, we wouldn't be in the position that we are now. So I won't slow down reading. So you guys continue.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes.
And this is to the administration. Is this true? We're 30 to $40 million behind because we didn't start the process earlier?
Yeah, what Commissioner Rader is referring to is, had we refinanced there was the potential for savings at order magnitude based on a quote that had been provided. So yes, the fact that the rates have been raised, the Fed has raised
We lost money.
the rates over.
So is there a mechanism in place that causes you to have to trigger refunding the debt? Should that be part of our policy?
Well, I think it's
Because
well,
right now you guessed them when to do it.
Yeah, no, it is further down in here.
Okay,
so
okay,
yeah,
good.
let's,
Oh, good. I just want to make sure we don't have it out here willy-nilly.
Yeah, no,
again.
it's further down and to try to capture that opportunity.
Okay.
Next red line. Within section N, they're under method of sale, subsection D here, regarding private or direct placement. So this was under some of the recommended changes from CFO McNabb regarding the original language under those private placements. So I'll just read through subsection D as it will read cleanly. Under certain circumstances, the county will directly negotiate financing terms with banks and financial institutions for specific borrowings on a private offering basis. Typically, private placements are carried out by the county when one, a private placement is likely to result in a lower borrowing cost. Two, when circumstances preclude public offerings. Three, as an interim financing tool. Or four, to avoid the cost of a public offering. Typically, the county will prepare a term sheet describing the issue and use that term sheet to solicit competitive bids from prospective investors.
So this helps to formalize the opportunity that we missed at the turn of the year, where private placement would have saved us substantially over a public offering, both in the interest rates that we received as well as the cost of debt issuance. This gives us more specific direction as to when to choose this type of financing mechanism and allows us to act more timely when it comes to making that decision.
Question.
Yes.
Where is it, and maybe further down, let me know, how do we put stipulations in there for minority participation? Where is that? Is that in the document somewhere?
That is going to be the regular course of the debt offering. In other words, there is, who you're dealing with here is with banks as opposed to with, with firms that are delivering services. We will see the opportunity to address minority participation when it comes to finance advisor. There is when we do private placements or when we go to some other means of finance where you put together these consortiums, as you remember how we did in 2011. There was an opportunity to build a diverse team within that context. What this does is allow us to use a low-cost means of being able to place existing debt, typically with a lower interest rate within a financial institution. And so it does not immediately yield, since they're corporations, and there does not yield the opportunity for, the lows. Remember, it's a local small business program that we have. And by definition, these businesses are not going to be small businesses. Even if they were minority owned, they wouldn't be the scale that would fit into our LSBE.
Right. I'm just trying to think, and not just those types, but the ones that we have to put out. Can we put something in here, or that could be part of the bonding company?
We might, but it can't be really put under the private placement piece.
Right, I
What it may
understand that.
do is we, like under, and perhaps we could add a clause saying where respondents would, meet the requirements of our LSB program, that shall apply.
Okay, because my thought was if you can't deal with these big institutions, but if you have a company that works in the bonding industry that's minority driven, that since we're talking about debt and they may want to be part of that we have a category that we have something there about 30%, 35% minority participation in those type of bond deals. I don't know where they may go, Mr. Chair, but just something
Yeah.
since we're talking
No,
about
I
that.
agree with you, and let me work with staff and see if we can't find.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right. Keep going.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, so I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. It's caught up in your picture frame.
Oh, it's okay. I just wanted to say, you know, as it relates to minority participation, I totally support the inclusion of traditionally underserved and marginalized individuals in governmental contracting. And even when we sit here and we speak of LSBE, our local small business enterprise program, you know, the problem with the program is the difference between practice and theory. In theory, it sounds good, but in practice, many of the LSBEs are not receiving their fair share of the contracts even after approved, although their approval could have been linked to the inclusion of an LSBE, because it does give more points as a general rule on that ITB, on the invitation to bid. And what I would like to see us do, and I think Commissioner Johnson, this may be your committee, I think it's time we have the conversation. It appears to me that we use the term minority, but we're just using the term. We are not, in my opinion, truly committed. And there's a difference between us saying it, and I don't want it to be something where we pick and choose where. If we have a minority participation clause or provision, I think it should be across the board. It shouldn't just be, in my opinion, in certain agreements. I think that we should offer or have a comprehensive policy that applies to all of our opportunities in DeKalb. And I may be the only person that feels that way. That could be the case, but it's time we really address this, because with the LSBE program that we have, even members of the LSBE program, you know, that I've spoken with have, you know, given suggestions on ways to improve the program. And I think it's time we have that conversation, and we need to determine whether or not we're going to use the word minority participation, or whether or not we are an LSBE program. And I want to hear from legal. Are we, because, you know, this is confusing to me. Are we allowed to have stipulations for minority participation here in DeKalb County on our contracts and agreements? And another part of this too is, even when we send out things for bid, if it is our policy that there is a certain amount of minority participation or LSBEs participate, then even when we transfer money to other entities that we may choose to do business with as commissioners, then we need to be very clear in that, so that after work is performed, it cannot be said that there was not an inclusion and not diversity at the table during the conversation, after the conversation has taken place. Because if we're clear in what our demands and our requirements are, then we would get what we expect. And when contracts go out, that particular vendor would know exactly how to patrol. Because we need to define what minority participation is, because you ask various people, you'll get various definitions of what it looks like. So Ms. Ernst, Attorney Ernst, I see you there. So I just want to hear from you, because I'm confused on where we are as a county as it relates to minority participation and the use of the term.
Yes, ma'am. Commissioners, as you all know, your LSB ordinance is gender and race neutral. It applies to local and small businesses. In order to have a goal of some level of minority participation, the United States Supreme Court in the late 90s, early 2000s issued several rulings requiring a certain foundational basis and factual basis. So at this time, the county does not have such a policy. In order to have it would require a study to be done. And that study would have to conform with current legal precedents involving those kinds of goals and minority participation ordinances. So you are correct, Commissioner Cochran-Johnson. There is not a definition because there's not one in place. And you could not put one in place without doing the requisite study, which is, at least from some of the other jurisdictions, I haven't looked at this in a while, Commissioner, but at some of the other jurisdictions, the studies took between 1 and 3 years to complete.
Absolutely. And with that said, I want to be very clear. You know, I support us having a minority participation provision, but I never want any of us to hold folk accountable for something for which we have not clearly defined to them if we are sending contracts out for bid. You don't send a contract out and then come back. Right now, all we say is LSBE. And to be honest, I believe we say that because we're afraid. In America, we're afraid to have a race conversation. People fail to acknowledge that racism exists only when you fail to acknowledge we all have inherent differences and biases. But if you allow those biases to affect how you treat others, that's the definition of racism as I define it. So I want us to have the conversation because I never want us to send out a contract here for or award monies and have someone come back and say there wasn't a black face at the table, there wasn't a white face at the table, or that anyone's interest wasn't looked out for, or that we did not include a variety of different players. So I think I will take that mantle up, Commissioner Johnson, and be happy to work with you on it so that we have a policy.
All right, let's go. Let's do
Okay.
it.
Let's move to the next one.
So commissioners, there are a couple more edits. We're just about at the bottom here. So in section Q, under debt policy review, the Board of Commissioners will semi-annually, i.e. twice per year, review the county's debt obligations as well as the debt management policy to ensure best county interests, objectable laws, industry best practices, and fiduciary responsibility. This semi-annual review is to take place within the Finance Audit and Budget, i.e. FAB Committee. Subsection A of section Q here, as part of this semi-annual review, the Finance Director shall report on the maturity and eligibility for refinancing of any debt that the county may have at that time. Subsection B, the Finance Director shall report initially and thereafter no less than 60 days before the event, the call date of all debt issued by the county. The Finance Director shall submit to the FAB Committee a report on capital market conditions relevant to the refunding of such debt and a recommendation on the disposition of such refunding opportunities.
And Commissioner Cochran-Johnson, this is the mandate to address this as we know that it's coming up. Every one of these refunding opportunities, when we issue the debt, we know when this opportunity will come up. So the October refunding was established in 2011. And so this simply requires that these reviews and recommendations be made in a timely basis so we can act at the opportunity.
I completely understand because, you know, have we had this in place? You know, I get it.
Okay. And that is, I guess there's a couple other.
There's a minor addition under the authority clause in the last sections here. Just reading the final sentence of that clause, this policy shall be administered on behalf of the county chief executive officer, the county executive assistant, finance director, and treasurer. And those exhaust staff's recommended changes, and I see that County Attorney Ernst does also have her hand up.
Ms. Ernstes.
Commissioners, I received this policy last Wednesday. I have sent it to bond counsel for review and have also reviewed it initially. We have sent some changes and some questions back to staff and to the finance department. So I wanted to advise you to expect another draft in the near future. And I sent that, I believe, yesterday afternoon. So obviously, finance staff and folks have not had an opportunity to answer the questions and look at the changes and see if they agree with them. But I did want you to know that we are in the midst of reviewing it as requested.
All right. With that in mind, I'd entertain a motion for a 2-week deferral, and we can put this on our agenda next time.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. And I'm hoping that at the next meeting with the revisions, we can move ahead with a recommendation. So with that in mind, I'll call the question. All in favor, please raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. All right, thank you for reviewing that with us. We're going to dispense with our American Rescue Plan report. We continue to work on that report, but now let's go. I guess Mr. Sigler is going to give us a more comprehensive presentation on the millage and budget amendments. Do you have any preliminary comments, Mr. Williams?
No, Mr. Chair, no preliminary comments. I think Mr. Sigler sent out the slide deck that he'll be presenting. And if there's things if there's things you want.
Is that the slide deck from this morning? I think I saw him send at 11 o'clock, something like that, right?
So, Mr.
And of
Sigler,
course, we've been meeting constantly since that point, so.
Right. And so one of the things I was thinking, if there's suggestions as Mr. Sigler presents, because there's some enhancements we're doing for tonight's presentation too. So we want to give him an opportunity if possible to do that. TJ?
Yes, so Ms. Williams is correct that we've been working on the presentation that was given this morning to add some additional context and some additional information for the public. So I can share that. I don't have a separate presentation right now that goes into a lot of the detail on the mid-year budget proposal. There are a few items that we're still just kind of refining at this point. But if you'd like me to, I can go through basically a recap of what we did this morning and some of the additional.
Well, the one thing that you didn't do is go through the budget as Commissioner Larry Johnson had suggested and identify the changes. For instance, I see that you are forecasting about $14 million more in revenues. I guess that's about a 7% increase in tax revenues, and then host at a higher rate than that, I guess, almost a 20%, or not 20%, but about 11, 12% increase in host revenues. So there's certainly those. There are other nets, but net 27 million on a 419 or 420 million expected total revenue, which is a significant increase. And then you also have proposed some changes in funding. You might want to go through those changes and tell us what those funds are for.
Right. I'm not sure if we're prepared to do that at this point, but what I could do is explain a bit more about the proposed millage rates as well as the tax digest, the trend, how that has gone, and also some other information that we will be presenting tonight for the evening public hearing.
All right. Well, when do you plan to present to the commission on the amendments to the budget that you're proposing?
As soon as we're ready to.
And hopefully that will be, what's today, Tuesday, by the end of the week, or Monday's a holiday. So hopefully by Friday, if not by next Tuesday.
Well, should we then schedule a special call meeting of this committee?
We're going to reach out to you on that, Commissioner. I'm thinking, yes, I think is the answer.
Well, and moreover, it has been our, practice to refer issues to the committees of jurisdiction. Now, they all have full agendas, but at the same time, we're talking about adding almost 5 million to the IT budget, which always seems like a good investment, but it would be
Well-
nice to know 3 million to facilities, $1 million at the libraries.
So here's something.
A total of 16 million in recurring expenses. So that's a significant increase to our base budget.
Right, and so
Mr. Chair,
even those, we want to have,
Yes, Commissioner Johnson.
now what, you got some different, what numbers are you looking at? So I can
This is
have.
what
you
they
have.
sent last night at 6:45 and then again this morning at.
Oh, okay. Let me go back and look. I just saw the big sheet with all of those numbers, but you got some amendments and somewhere.
Well, it is that entire package. The first part of it is setting the millage rates, and so it's
Yeah.
the resolution. And then the end of it, starting on page 9, is what they
Budget.
refer to as Schedule A, which are the budget amendments.
Okay, good. I'll go back then. Thank you.
and if I
Yes,
may,
Ms. Williams.
yes. So a couple of things. The things that you just identified are certainly things that we're evaluating, but we're also going to be evaluating those and others in the context of the ARP funding, much like we did last year. So, that's why we're not in a position to present final recommendations, because we want
Okay,
to look.
so
at
if they are identified as eligible for ARP, then they would come out of this budget because this is our tax funds budget.
Right. That's exactly, we're saying the same thing. And so that's why we want a couple more days to be able to come up with what we're proposing. If you recall, last year, the issue is the millage rate, that vote. If the board delayed, and I'm not proposing that at this time, but if the budget amendments were bifurcated, we've done that before. So,
Okay, but also with the millage rate, would we not have to also finalize our allocation of host funds to offset the millage?
I believe so. TJ?
I believe that's correct. That would be in tandem with the millage rate
All
approval.
right, well, that is a substantive issue. And I'm just going to tell folks, I'm not going to let y'all hunt for it, but if you look on page 10 of this document, you will see our e-host reserves projected to rise to almost $62 million. The e-host reserve is statutorily limited to tax relief. And so we have been building quite rapidly a reserve in e-host. If you look at last year's budget, I think that the e-host reserve was at about maybe $20 million. Our budget is approved this year is expecting it at 44 million. And then the mid-year is proposing to elevate that to 62 million. So what that opens for me is the opportunity to more fully deploy those e-host revenues to tax relief. And what that would do is go beyond the relief on the general fund millage and the hospital fund, which are countywide millages. And then it would extend property tax relief to either our unincorporated area taxes that include the unincorporated fund, the special service district, fire and police, and then on the other hand, for municipalities, they might see a reduction in their police, or they might see a credit against their municipal taxes. And in that way, we would actually realize a real reduction in the tax bill. So I would like to put that on the table as something that we consider.
Right, and can we explore that with the law department and such? I mean, I see where you're going, Commissioner, but.
Okay, but again, since y'all, right now you're proposing that we make a decision on, as it's currently styled, both of these at our next Board of Commissioners meeting. And whereas I know that we can defer action on the budget itself, I think that we're going to need to decide whether or not we're going to commit more of these host or these e-host reserves to tax reduction. and give our stakeholders a break. So given the fact that time is short, I'd be glad for you all to present on that, but convene a special call and have you work with our central staff to accomplish that.
Okay, and we'll reach out to them and you to see when's the most appropriate next week. So
And
would you like,
again, I'd like some feedback from the members of the committee, because if I can't get it out of committee, then I'm probably not going to get it far. Commissioner Cochran Johnson.
Yes, I just wanted to say that, today I think in our BOC was probably a shadowing of what you'll experience this evening. And I just want to caution us. I know that even with the best intent, one may not have the capacity from time to time to reach deadlines, but we have a scheduled meeting tonight to discuss the budget. And we're really, in many ways, in my opinion, not there. And, it's better that sometimes you not act than act prematurely, because, you see the line items, but particularly, and you saw a foreshadowing of it today, it's not enough to just say that you're going to make an investment. People want to know how exactly the investment will be allocated, in what particular ways. And again, I just don't think tonight that, we are there for us to be actually having, the meeting at this point. Now, as it relates to e-host, everyone is discussing a rise in tax liability. I'm beginning to receive those emails now, multiples per day. And I think if there is a way to use e-host to somewhat mitigate, but also the education factor is very important here, because, Mr. Siegler, you're going to have people understand, they feel that the increase in tax digest that they're experiencing is a result of us, but it's a result of the rise in property values. But I'm also beginning to get quite a few calls from individuals who are expressing concern because, again, this goes back to housing in general, of purchases within communities, revitalization, and the effect that it's having on their property value. Now, I've asked this question a few times, and I think this is a Mr. Hicks, Calvin Hicks, perhaps, I'm not sure, whether or not it's also Tax Commissioner Johnson. But what are we doing? Because these are the things that people want to know to ensure that a rise in property value that may be inflated as a result of what we're seeing in the housing market, because people are no longer competing with each other to purchase homes. They're competing with LLCs, private investors, and Wall Street. 57%. And I see your hand keep going up, Mr. Williams. I want to hear answers. And people do too, but I just want you to be prepared, because these are the type things that people want to know. And this is something that we've said, and I know we can't do it all. I want someone to just admit that, because we'll have conversations around here and things just dissipate like a bubble in the wind. And then all of a sudden, when it's, the difficult conversation is there, we've not had the conversation before the conversation. And there's no plan, because I said what we need is a rubric, because, when it comes to private investors, they are paying far above asking price in many instances, because they are the lending institution. But a general individual can't do that, because they're going to need to have an appraisal. And I don't care what you want, a bank isn't going to lend you more than fair market value. If there's a difference between fair market and asking price, or what you perceive the value to be, then you come out of your pocket with it. But I don't know what it is we're doing to offset that imbalance that you're seeing in the system. So I'll be quiet, Mr. Williams, because I've seen your finger a few times. So I suppose you have a few answers, but, back to you, Mr. Chair.
All right, Mr. Terry, is your question on a different topic, or should we allow Mr. Williams to respond at this point?
Yeah, no, please. I'd like to hear Mr. Williams.
All
Right,
right.
and so, I'm agreeing with actually Commissioner Cochran Johnson, and like a lot of the discussion, which is actually a certain amount of confusion around how the e-host applies and what it means to the individual tax bill. So I think that tonight, one of the key things that needs to be articulated is how it has affected the tax bill and how it is essentially a reduction in the tax bill. And although people have gotten their assessments, you know, and the values are going up and so forth, we probably do have to do a better job with explaining what that really means to your general fund tax bill, so that when people, if their tax bills are actually going up, it is likely that they are non-homesteaded properties, or maybe it's the school system or someone else's taxes. It's not going to be.
Yes, that's the first distinction you're going to have to draw, because they see their aggregate tax bill, and the largest line on that, 2/3 of it, is the taxes levied by the Board of Education, which are not subject to either our assessment freeze or the host rebate. So that is an unprotected levy, but it's not levied by the Board of Commissioners. And back when I was originally, back in the day, Commissioner Johnson and I will remember, we used to explain that in the tax bill in very vivid detail. And it was helpful to our stakeholders. The Board of Education didn't like it much because it put the spotlight on their part of the tax bill. But nevertheless, it did help us to explain that. And I think that knowledge has largely been lost upon our stakeholders. So that is something that I hope that we can talk a lot more about, because when they talk about the tax bill, they're not talking about the county, you know, general fund or the police fund. They're talking about the tax bill, the one that they receive and that we collect.
The overall tax bill.
Yeah, Commissioner Terry.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree with that statement. I think there is maybe a little bit of confusion, or just sort of looping in the school board's policies, which, you know, clearly anything, you know, policies we make here don't affect that. And so I think one of the questions that came up this morning from a resident, and I think she's watching now because I told her to tune in, is if Mr. Siegler could just explain the senior tax exemption that I guess we've put in place, but it might be different than the school's exemption. I guess maybe it's based on income and age.
Well,
but
first of all, Mr. Terry, please remember that all of these exemptions, whether it is a homestead exemption or the senior tax exemption or the assessment freeze, are all acts of the legislature. These are not things that the Board of Commissioners can unilaterally accomplish.
Thank you.
And so, Mr. Siegler, you may want to talk about those credits against the tax bill and from what authority they are derived.
Yeah, and that was more just for like tonight's presentation, really.
Okay.
You know, I know Ms. Fendrick was emailed and asked us about it, and she's watching now, but I feel like that's something that's come up over and over again. Another thing I'd wanted to just say is that I do believe that we need to take a hard look at the assessment system. I'll just call it a system. There's a lot of guessing that goes on. You know, they would say it's an educated guess, but it's still a guess. It's still human beings having to decide these things. We had a property tax workshop on Saturday with Ms. Trimble, who runs Grandma Ma's house. And she is someone who, you know, is in essence a nonprofit business that provides just, you know, these sort of basic kind of points of, here's how you apply for your exemptions, here's how you apply for appeals. And just information that I've been given over the last month and presentations I've seen, to me really suggests that it's not our tax assessor, it's just the tax assessing system. You know, I think it's got some racist elements to it. I think there's a lot of very interesting results that come out of the tax assessment system, depending on how much money you have, how high sort of I guess the wherewithal you have to digest and analyze and then even challenge, an appeal, with an appeal or the assessment. And I just think there's a lot of elements of this assessment system that are kind of rigged in the sense that it just requires additional level of understanding.
Mr. Terry, I certainly sympathize with that. I've heard that for most of my career.
Yes.
The unfortunate fact is that the assessment system is defined by state law and is run by our Board of Assessors. We recently approved a new member of that board,
Yep.
and I think it would behoove us to develop a stronger relationship, not simply with the tax assessor or the chief assessor, but also with the board to whom the assessor is responsible.
That's right, that we
and
approve.
to try to address some of those issues within that context. Again, what we're trying to get through theoretically in the next 2 weeks, but certainly by the end of the month, is setting millage rates and
Yep.
determining what part of this e-host reserve to devote to tax relief in this current 2022 tax year.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm sorry, I was filibustering, taking the long way around the barn to get to the main point. And maybe the main question, because we're seeing the e-host reserve go up, we're seeing the budgetary reserve go down. And so I think what I'm looking for from the CEO is, are we still ants or are we grasshoppers? And is the notion that we are still saving up that reserve for an impending economic collapse, a major budget shortfall, for a major emergency? And then, and so I think I'm just looking for that sort of overall budgetary philosophy. And then I would argue that to a certain extent, we are in kind of a crisis, whether it's because of inflation or just the general uncertainty in our political environment and economic environment. And I do believe that philosophically, we should find some way to create relief for those who either need it or, might, be impacted by some of the increases that I think we're expecting. And then the final point I'll just make is, again, that if I think that it would almost be helpful, this is just from a kind of a purely, educational or sort of, what if, scenario, but I think it's important to acknowledge that if we did do the rollback rate, what that actually would mean. What are the practical implications of certain services that we provide, certain investments that I think are priorities for the government and for our citizens? What are the actual practical implications? Because it's easy to say, let's do a rollback rate or let's lower the rate a little bit. But then what actually does that mean? Does it mean the reserve goes down? Does it mean these programs get cut or delayed? And so I think part of that education is to show the different scenarios instead of just saying, here's one decision you can make, vote yes or no. And that's just a general point of contention I'll continue to make as a commissioner. There's really not much tweaking that we're given the opportunity to make when we're presented this document. And so it's hard for, I think, me and maybe us in general to navigate where we're going if we don't really have the full picture of where the CEO wants us to go. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, could I?
Mr. Williams.
Yeah, and just to respond, Commissioner Terry, excellent question, when you asked, are we still ants or, to use that Aesop's fable, and I would say most definitely. We are faced, as a municipal corporation, right, with 6,500 employees and over $1 billion budget. The cost of our fuel, the cost of our contracts, whether it's asphalt, building materials, all those things are going up. Labor is harder to find. So all of those things we are faced with. So we are trying our best in the designing of this budget to be mindful that not only are, the headwinds are kind of blowing, but, we're looking at the same forecast that everyone else is, right? That say that there may well be a recession on the horizon. So, we're being mindful of that. So you would not anticipate, right, a lot of new programs or things like that. We're trying to, ensure, that we hold on to those, commitments we made at the beginning of the year. And the CEO articulated, that we wanted to really focus on our workforce, the retention, the recruitment, and the conversation this morning with the pay for our public safety professionals is part of that. All of that is just recognizing the competitive environment that we're in. So, yes, I would say we're still, budgeting conservatively. Yes, sir. And so, Mr. Chair, if we want Mr. Sigler to walk through things, or how would you like to proceed? Commissioner Rader? You're on mute, Commissioner Rader.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was your question again?
Yeah, I was just saying, would you like TJ to proceed, or how would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, you can go ahead. I don't think that you need to represent what you presented this morning.
Okay.
But instead, I mean, we're trying to figure out substantive information upon which to make a decision. We've asked several questions and y'all weren't prepared to address any questions related to the budget. As it relates to, I guess, the millage rates, is that what you want to?
Right, and that is the
focus on?
Yes, that's the presentation for today, and that would be the presentation tonight. Additionally, though, to take a point from this conversation, one of the things that we will be presenting in depth tonight would be, just showing how the tax dollar is allocated between the municipalities, the school board, and DeKalb County. And we will show what eHost has done by, removing the general fund and hospital fund contribution. I think TJ showed a slide earlier.
Yes.
When we talk about tax relief, I think we're giving on average a $1,200 tax relief to every taxpayer or every homesteaded property taxpayer.
Okay.
But that's being lost in the conversation. So
right, and I agree with those. And I think, maybe the commissioners want to hear it, but it is certainly important for you to fully lay that out tonight. But if we have any specific questions about the millage rate, my primary question on the topics that you had reviewed was our ability to use the eHost reserve to further increase the credit and let it go against those taxes that we're now paying. Because right now, all of the county taxes or the unincorporated taxes and municipal taxes are not covered by the eHost.
Correct.
And the legislation, the state statute, provides that should we fully offset the countywide levies, that eHost can be applied to the sub-county levies. And I want to explore that option because that would increase substantive tax relief to our stakeholders, or to at least the homesteaded stakeholders. The folks that aren't homesteaded never get any relief. So,
yeah, and we'll take a look at that, Commissioner. We're not prepared to answer that.
All right. Well, it's not just a request. It is. I'm going to advance a amendment to accomplish it. So y'all need to work on it.
Understood. So at this point, I don't know if there's anything specific, or TJ can go work on the presentation for tonight.
Is there any, Mr. Terry, you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Were you asking if we have questions about the budget?
Well, they've said that they're not ready to deal with the budget amendment.
Okay.
The Schedule A, and that we might separate that from action on the millage rates, which are necessary in order to prepare the tax bill. And what that would then do is, insofar as are the are y'all fully expending the increases in revenues that you would expect? I think you're going to, at any rate, that doesn't, but they're not prepared to discuss the budget amendment, so that may well get detached from the resolution to set the millage rates. But we do have to deal with the e-host by in the same time frame as we do the millage rates. Other questions? I don't see any other members of the commission on the line. Is there anybody other than those that are on camera? If you are here and you'd like to speak to any of this or ask questions, please, let yourself be recognized.
Not at this time, sir.
Okay. All right. So, there are going to be two other public hearings, one tonight and one the next day. I suppose that this is now focusing more on the millage rates.
That's correct.
And I think that Commissioner Cochran-Johnson, just in order for us to formalize the direction that we're going, I'd entertain a motion that this committee recommend that we separate the amendments to the budget from the establishment of the millage rates, but that we continue to work on this issue of the application of the e-host reserve to potentially reduce, the tax bill.
Understood and so moved.
All right, I'll second that. All in favor, please raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
Great. All right, so you have the committee suggesting that you would focus solely on millage rates going between now and the adoption, and then we also need to get to that e-host reserve issue.
Right. Well, like next week we'll be in IRPS and going over public safety. So I think we would still meet with committees and
Yeah, that's right. You can go ahead and continue to work on the budget, but I'm just saying that we're not going to take action on the budget amendments on the 12th of July as was originally proposed in this agenda item. That's, or at least that'll be the committee's recommendation, is that we divide the two. And I would anticipate that we'll have a special call meeting of this committee, since otherwise we won't be able to meet again and make a recommendation. But it seems as though our focus, the millage rates are what they are, unless we want to change, what our anticipated reserves are. It would be useful to know, because there are some substantial changes in the budgetary reserve in the various accounts. Some of them, for instance, as was originally proposed in the February budget, we do see a drawdown on the budgetary reserve in the general fund from let's see, the budgetary reserve is proposed to go from $40 million in our February budget to 31.6 in this budget. I think, can you tell us why that is, Mr. Sigler?
Partially, that's a function of that e-host reserve, because the e-host revenues have been going up more quickly than the property taxes for the general fund and the hospital fund.
Right,
So
but I'm
there's
talking about the
additional-
budgetary reserve is also going from 40 to 31.6, and then e-host reserve is going from 44 to 61. And so in aggregate, the total reserves would rise, but the budgetary reserve would decline.
Right, and more or less what happens is that it gets shifted, as that gap increases between what we're collecting and then what's, being then billed in terms of the property taxes for general and hospital.
Okay, but it seems to me that the e-host reserve is reserved exclusively for tax relief. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and then I'm still not sure that I understand why applying more of that $61 million to property tax relief would have an effect on the line above it, which is budgetary reserve. I see the total reserves, being comprised of budgetary plus e-host reserves. But why is it if we spend that down that that's going to have an effect on our budgetary reserve?
Well, I think you need to look at it in the larger, across all tax funds, because our goal had been to get to 2 months. And really part of what you see with the millage rates changing and those reserves changing is a lot of that was within the general fund, the 2 months reserve. And we're trying to get the other funds back up to the 2 months reserve too. So it's spread out more equally. So I think that's probably, maybe more directly related to your question about, why is the budgetary reserve lower in the general fund? It's mostly due to just trying to get it, the fund balance balanced out between the various funds.
Okay, so you were basically reducing the general fund millage rate, generating less money and bringing down that reserve, but then you're using that millage capacity in other unincorporated funds. Is that right?
That's correct. And I think what that'll allow us to do going forward is, as we have those fund balances stabilized at that level, is then to stabilize the millage rates more as well.
Well, that's always been our goal. 16 years I've been here and we've never done that.
I think we're getting closer.
Stable millage rates, but not stable. For instance, in the fire fund, it appears that you're going from 7 to 15 in order to achieve a 2-month fund balance there, right?
That's correct.
And you'd had to raise the millage rate in order to accomplish that. Is that correct?
That's right. So that's the case in the fire fund as well as in the designated services fund. Designated services fund does have some proposed funding for operations as well. That's a component of that change in the millage rate. And again, I think what this will allow us to do going forward, though, is have a more consistent, maybe it's not 100% the same millage rate every year, but I think it's going to be less volatile than it has been.
Okay, and then I'm looking here in the hospital fund, we're up to 2.9 months reserve. It's a relatively small fund. And then police fund, I see you hitting 2%. And then countywide bond fund, that one really is not applicable. The debt service, airport, okay. So those are areas, so it's really those top ones. All right, so again, I'd like to explore further so you've answered that question, is that you're reducing the general fund reserve because it is in excess of 2 months, and you're bringing it down to 2.6 months. Is that intended to be calculated on the line item that is called budgetary reserve or on total reserves?
So it does include the total reserves there.
Okay, but isn't it true that e-host reserves can only be used for tax relief? It can't be used to offset operating costs. Isn't that true?
It's correct, but I think in the event that there was a severe downturn, what the way that mechanism would function is there would be an increase in the millage rates that would then be offset by that e-host reserve. That was, I believe, the intent when we first began to include the e-host reserve, is that, it was to guard against any sort of downturn in the economy and revenue.
Okay, it looks like a big number though. So what I would suggest is that you do a sensitivity analysis and tell me how far the digest would have to fall in order to require a full 61 million of the e-host reserve to, somehow offset that. Because again, you're only currently offsetting general and hospital fund taxes. So it does seem as though, I just like to understand that thinking, because again, we're having a lot of people that are frustrated about higher taxes, and there seems to be money to provide them additional relief.
We'll get you an analysis of that. Really what it's been occurring, as I said, is that the e-host revenues, our sales tax revenues, have been growing substantially, and the growth in the millage rates and the property taxes haven't kept pace. So that's why that number continues to grow.
Yeah, but So it should be used for tax relief. I mean, I think that's the statutory purpose of it, not as a rainy day fund.
Correct. And we don't call it the rainy day fund. It's a reserve. So we include it in the total reserves number.
Well, I mean, then you should include the other reserves in that number too. But, I'll look forward to your analysis on that. And we'll work with staff to try to, put that idea in in an executable form. Mr. Terry.
I just wanted to ask a question about the projections for the e-host and I guess SPLOS for that matter, because it is the assumption that if there was an economic downturn, I guess next year is what we're thinking we're preparing for. It seems like we're preparing for something, but no one wants to say it. But is there an expectation that the sales tax revenues would decline so much that
I guess
that reserve would be eaten up?
Yeah. And you said
like in short order? Would it sustain us for 2 years? Is it like, I guess maybe the larger question, TJ, is do we do like 5-year budget forecasts?
We're working to develop something like that to have a longer term financial plan. But in response to your question about sales tax, really kind of what precipitated the whole discussion of the e-host reserve was during 2020, as we were going into setting the millage rate and doing the mid-year budget, we saw, a considerable, I want to say it was about 15-20% decline in sales tax collections at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we were preparing to have to be able to, sustain operations and, provide the same amount of tax relief as we had in the past. And that's kind of when that concept was introduced. But, we didn't know at the time that sales taxes would actually begin increasing, much faster than they had in the previous years. That was the information we had at the time, and it was, what we based sort of our recommendations on. And then since then, it's just been a little bit, surprising, I think, how strong, sales tax revenues have been.
Okay. And then can you just speak to what is the philosophy behind keeping reserves in the police fund? What is that being saved for?
Well, it's really for the same purpose of any of the funds. Is if there is, let's say that there is a recession next year, and housing market cools off, those funds are available if we need to, if revenues are down, we can use those funds. We can tap those funds to continue operations at the same level. That's really the purpose of having the rainy day funds for all the funds.
Yeah, it is an interesting concept though, because during the recession, did the last major budget hit that we took a decade ago, did we cut police services?
I would have to go back and double check that. I mean, I know that there were some reductions at some point, maybe not necessarily due to the recession, but the incorporation of new cities and so forth. There were some changes to the police staffing, I believe, at the time. I do know that, over time, the number of police officers, has decreased. And again, that's, largely a function of the new cities incorporating.
Okay. And so this reserve could be a potential hedge against a new city or a current city taking over their own police services? Potentially.
I don't know that we've ever viewed it that way, necessarily, but if yes, for instance, if a new city incorporated and decided that they were going to provide their own police services, and we saw a large decline in our tax base for the police fund, then it would be available for that.
Okay. And now, I feel like I know the answer to this, but the police fund is countywide, right?
No. So the police fund, right. The police fund is actually a special tax district. So it's all of unincorporated, and then the cities have the option to opt in to really two parts of it: the basic police operations and the non-basic operations. And then the cities are billed at a lower millage rate than unincorporated as well.
Okay. And has the police fund reserve, has it always sort of hovered around 20 million, or has that been built up over?
I think, again, I just talking from my memory, I mean, it has grown. It was not always 20 million. It's grown just as the budget has grown, and also just as the economy recovered, in the Great Recession, total reserves were in the negative at the end of, I want to say 2011. Mm-hmm. So, we've come a long way since then. I think we're close to where we want to be in all those areas. And that's, really comes down though, it's a policy decision about what the fund balance should be.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess just from a philosophical perspective, I mean, even as we're talking about being, the ant and saving for the possibility that we're going to need that reserve, we're also talking about increasing police funding. So even in the context of let's save money, we are actually spending more on police. And so it begs the question, if we had an economic downturn, would we really cut police services? It seems like that'd be the last thing to be cut, quite frankly. But I suppose maybe this is simply there to offset other cuts that might, come, and it doesn't come as much from the other funds. It just comes from this fund. And so in a way, this police reserve fund is just, it still serves as a rainy day fund in general, because things can be moved around on the spreadsheet.
Well, right. So I mean, in general, it is a hedge against, any sort of, decline in revenue. And, to your point, would we cut police? The good news is in that, in the event that happened, we might not have to cut police because we would have the reserve funds available for that. And, we try not, we don't move money between the various funds. They do fluctuate sometimes based on, the decisions made about the millage rates, really, and that's why they have changed, and fluctuated so much. Is just trying to get all the funds kind of to a healthy level of fund balance. And, I think, like I said, we're getting very close in this year's budget to achieving that across all funds. And, I think, that would be a great accomplishment for us considering where we've been.
Okay. And then last question, there was mention of you wanted to, Commissioner Rader said after 16 years, you've been trying to stabilize the millage rate. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
So we have 6 different millage rates currently. It was 7. And the practice has been to keep the total aggregate millage rate for the unincorporated area at the 20.81, at least since 2015. I believe there was a tax decrease actually in 2015. Those rates declined somewhat. And so what that means is, yes, that number hasn't changed since 2015, but the individual funds have. So, 1 year, well, and you'll see it actually. Let me share my screen and I'll show what
Okay.
I'm referring to.
Commissioner Terry, we're running out of time,
That was the last question.
but let's go ahead and take a look at that.
Okay. This was added to the presentation for tonight. So if you look at this last table here, where it says millage rates by fund, you'll see where some of the numbers have changed year over year. So what's proposed right now for the general fund is 0.12 mils lower. The hospital fund actually, though, because we look at those kind of in tandem, goes up by the 1.2 mils. And again, that's trying to sort of balance or stabilize the fund balances between those two funds. Same thing is kind of happening if you look at police versus the designated services. Is there's some decrease there, and it's offset by increases here, as well as in the fire fund. And again, the major thinking behind that was to stabilize the fund balances.
All right, we're going to pick this up at 6 o'clock. at this public hearing. So in the interest of everybody's sort of being ready for that, I'm going to, or I guess it's at 6, right?
That's correct.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to entertain a motion to adjourn at this point, and then we can pick that up at 6:30 when we do the public hearing.
So moved.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you for attending.